As philosophers, I think we all constantly find ourselves wrestling with these big questions, right? Like, what is the nature of existence and how do we know what we know?
Yeah.
And what are values and what is the mind? What is language? Um, Even going so far as to question what makes a person a person.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because as soon as you start looking into philosophical history in different cultures around the world, you realize that these ideas that seem universal
Hmm.
are actually anything but.
Hmm.
One society's view of personhood can be totally different from another.
Totally different. And that's what makes it so interesting, right? So today we're stepping outside the comfortable Western philosophical traditions and going on a deep dive into the Akan philosophy of the person.
Go.
This is a philosophy that has developed over centuries with roots going all the way back to before the 13th century. It comes from the Akan people of West Africa. And what makes this even more intriguing is that it's not just some abstract theory. This philosophy has a real impact on their social structures, their daily lives, and how they make judgments about identity, morality, and community.
It's woven into the fabric of their lives.
Exactly.
And for a philosopher like yourself, what makes this exploration so engaging is that the Akan conception of personhood isn't just one single view.
Right.
We'll be focusing on two very influential Akan thinkers, Kwasi Wiredu and Kwame Gyekye.
Awesome. So think of these two philosophers as our guides on this journey. Wiredu, he emphasizes that personhood is something you achieve. It's a process, and it's heavily influenced by how society recognizes you and the development of certain qualities. But then you have Gyekye.
Yeah.
He puts more emphasis on innate human qualities and the idea that we are all fundamentally morally equal because we're all human.
Yeah, it's really a chance to stretch your philosophical muscles here. We're
Yeah,
taking a non-Western perspective on a concept that's been central to so much philosophical debate, and you'll find some familiar ideas for sure.
of course.
But there are also some really significant and I think thought-provoking differences, especially when we look at how the Akan philosophy views the relationship between an individual and the community and what that means for ethics and responsibility.
Yeah, those are the interesting points of tension and contrast for sure.
Absolutely.
So our mission on this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We're going to extract the core principles of the Akan philosophy of the person. We're going to pay close attention to those contrasting viewpoints of Wiredu and Gyekye.
Right.
And we want to shed light on the philosophical significance of these ideas, maybe offer you some new perspectives on the very idea of personhood. So let's start unpacking this. Wiredu has this really interesting idea of degrees of personhood. He uses this quote from former Zambian President Konda, who said that Margaret Thatcher was truly a person.
Oh, interesting.
So what's the philosophical weight of that statement, would you say?
Well, I think the importance of Kaunda's comment, the way Weirdy looks at it, is that it shows us that in the Akan culture, and according to Weirdy's philosophy, being a person is not just a simple yes or no thing you get just because you're born.
Right, right.
It's seen more as a spectrum, something that has different levels. Like you could be more or less of a person. And when Kaunda says someone is truly a person, he's pointing to a higher level on that spectrum.
I see.
It's achievement.
Like being a person is a kind of accomplishment.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and Wiredu even points to the Akan word onipa as evidence of this
Right.
because sometimes it refers to just a biological human being,
Mhm.
but other times it means a human who has achieved a certain social status, right?
Exactly. And for Wiredu, this double meaning in the word shows us a deeper philosophical distinction.
Okay,
He separates being a human, the biological thing,
right,
from being a person.
right.
And a person is someone who has developed certain moral and metaphysical qualities.
Oh.
And they do that through their actions and how they interact with the community.
Hmm.
So, like you're born a human, that's a given, but you become a person.
Okay,
And how much of a person you become, well, that can change.
I see. So it's interesting because for a philosopher listening to this, it's pretty different from a lot of Western thought where, personhood is often just assumed to be the same as being human.
Right.
So in Wiredu's view, what's the motivation then? What do you get out of trying to reach these higher degrees of personhood?
It's not just an abstract or spiritual reward.
Okay.
In Wiredu's system, if you achieve a higher degree of personhood, you get real, tangible benefits within the community.
So it has social consequences.
Exactly. We're talking more rights, more privileges, and more social capital, meaning you have better access to resources and networks within your lineage. A full person, for Wiredu, is someone who's doing well economically,
Yeah.
but also, and this is key, they've shown a strong commitment to their family and the community through their actions and sense of responsibility.
They're a good person by the community standards, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is where Kwame Gyekye comes in with a really important counterargument. He challenges this whole idea of degrees of personhood.
Yeah.
He has a different perspective.
Yeah, Gyekye really pushes back against Wiredu's focus on social achievement as the defining feature of personhood.
Yeah.
He's worried, and it's a very philosophical worry, that this idea downplays the inherent moral equality that he believes we all have just because we're human.
I see.
We all have the capacity for reason, and that's what matters. He even brings up Kant's categorical imperative and this concept of a kingdom of ends to emphasize that every human has dignity regardless of their achievements or social status.
Right, right. So for Gyekye, being human, being capable of rational thought, that's the foundation of personhood. It doesn't matter what your social standing is or what you've achieved.
That's it, yeah. Geike's argument is that things like social status, habits, personality, these are all things a person acquires during their life. But the person, the being that acquires them, must exist before those things. He has this great quote, "One is a person because of what he is, not because of what he acquires."
That's a good quote.
Yeah, it really gets at the heart of his point.
Okay, so then how does Gyekye deal with those Akan expressions that seem to back up Wiredu's idea of degrees? Phrases like Onie nipa, which means he is not a person. Or Oye Oni Papa, she is a real person. Or even Oni Pahan, a useless person.
Cool. Gyekye argues that those phrases aren't literally saying someone isn't a person.
Okay.
He sees them as moral and social judgments. It's like the community is saying something about a person's character, their behavior, their status, their contributions.
So it's about their actions.
Exactly. And those things, actions, status, they can change. Personhood for Gyekye is the baseline. It's what we all start with. He thinks Wiredu is mixing up these two levels of analysis.
This difference in how they understand personhood, it really comes into focus when we look at how infants are seen in Akan thought.
Absolutely.
Because, as Wiredu points out, the Akan language often distinguishes infants from adults. It highlights their lack of intellectual and moral maturity,
Yeah.
which, on the surface, seems to support his idea that personhood is a gradual thing.
Yeah, it does.
But at the same time, these infants are still called Onipa,
Hmm.
and they're given a basic level of respect, presumably because they have the okra.
Right. Which aligns more with Gyekye.
Exactly. So how does Wiredu reconcile these seemingly contradictory ideas? He's a philosopher who really values consistency.
He's got to make it all fit together.
Right, exactly. So he acknowledges the okra, this essential element, but he doesn't see it as automatically meaning you're a full person.
Okay.
How does that work?
For Wiredu, having the okra is like having the potential for self-respect and moral agency.
Okay.
That's the foundation, the starting point.
But it's not the whole thing.
Exactly. But become a full person, you have to develop that potential further.
I see.
You have to grow morally, intellectually, and socially. Think of it like this. Okra is potential. And all the good qualities you develop, those are what actually make you a person.
I see. So he's drawing a line between moral agency, the ability to make moral choices,
Right.
and moral responsibility, how much you're held accountable for your actions.
Exactly. Wiredu would say that all humans, because they have okra, have the potential to act morally. But how much you're held responsible for your actions depends on how much you've developed that moral agency.
So when someone is judged on Nyanipa, it's not denying their basic moral capacity. It's saying they haven't fully developed it.
And haven't lived up to the responsibilities that come with being a full person.
Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense. And this two-level view, this baseline and then the developmental level, it helps explain some of the practices in Akan culture that might seem a bit unusual to us, like how they handle infant deaths.
Right, like the fact that they don't usually hold full funeral ceremonies for infants.
Yeah. Wiredu says that's because infants haven't reached that level of personhood that's needed for the journey to Esmondo, which is their ancestral world.
Right. The funeral rites are all about that journey.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not that infants aren't loved or valued.
Right.
It's that they haven't yet built up those social relationships or developed the moral character that's seen as necessary for that journey.
So the expected reaction to an infant's death is more like a quiet acceptance.
Yeah.
It's different from the intense mourning you see when an older person dies,
Right.
which is a really different way of thinking about infant loss compared to a lot of Western cultures.
Yeah.
It really shows the philosophical differences. And this connects to the Akan idea of reincarnation too, right?
It does. They believe that people who die before reaching their full potential, like infants, might get reincarnated,
Okay.
like a second chance.
Right. And Wiredu sees infants as being in this kind of limbo They have potential, but it hasn't been realized.
Untapped potential. And the idea is that reincarnation isn't random. It's connected to this process of becoming a moral agent.
I see.
The people who live good, morally exemplary lives, they become ancestors.
Right.
And they act as guides for the living.
Yeah.
It's like they've earned their spot in the ancestral realm.
Okay, that makes sense. So, of course, Gyekye has a different take on these practices.
Of course he does.
He doesn't buy Wiredu's explanation about degrees of personhood.
He really sticks to his guns on this. He says, and I quote, "A human person is a person whatever his age or social status."
He's very consistent.
Yeah, he believes that being a person is just part of being human. It's
Oh.
not something you earn over time.
Okay.
So he has to explain those different ways of treating infant and adult deaths in a different way.
Right.
So what's his alternative? He leans towards a more sociological and utilitarian explanation. He suggests that how big and elaborate a funeral is depends more on the person's social status, their wealth, their connections, and their impact on the community, rather than how much of a person they were.
Okay.
Like a respected elder who's contributed a lot to the community, they'll naturally have a bigger ceremony than a newborn.
Right.
And this happens regardless of whether we consider both of them to be persons in the basic sense.
That makes sense. He also sees reincarnation and this whole idea of graded personhood not as literal truths, but more as moral stories that societies create.
Yeah. For Gyekye, these are powerful cultural narratives, similar to, say, social contract theories in the West.
Okay.
And these stories encourage good behavior. They promote responsibility and community involvement.
It's like they have a social function.
Exactly. They shape people's values and beliefs and help hold the community together. For Gyekye, death ceremonies are more about the living community than about the dead person's journey.
Okay, that's a really interesting perspective. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about how someone actually achieves this higher degree of personhood according to Wiredu, because it seems very tied to your obligations and contributions within the community.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a key part of Wiredu's philosophy. He outlines a few criteria. It starts with that natural instinct to care for your close family.
Okay.
But then you have to extend that care and empathy outwards to your extended family and even to people you're not related to.
So it's like widening the circle.
Exactly. Getting married and having kids are important steps. They're expected. But just doing those things isn't enough to make you a real person in this system.
Okay.
What really matters is showing a deep and consistent commitment to everyone in that wider circle.
It's about action, not just words.
Exactly. So if someone takes care of orphaned relatives or supports people outside their immediate family, they're highly respected. They are the Oye Nipa, the real person.
Okay.
They're walking the walk.
And it's not enough to just have good intentions, right? Wiredu is really focused on tangible actions and contributions.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
He highlights the importance of making real material contributions to your lineage. You have to fulfill obligations that come up during big life events like births, deaths, illnesses, marriages, things like that.
So you have to show up for your family.
You have to be there for them, yeah. And if you don't, you risk being labeled Anye Nipa, which means you're not upholding your duties to the community.
Right.
And that can really hold you back from becoming a full person in this system.
It has real consequences.
Right.
So it extends beyond family, though, right? It goes to the community as a whole.
Right. It's not just about your family.
Right.
You need to be actively involved in community projects, building and maintaining infrastructure, keeping things clean, attending funerals, being present in all those ways.
Okay.
And it's also important to participate in civic rituals and groups like fellowship groups or those informal credit associations. All these things show you're committed to the common good.
Right. I guess it's a way of addressing the free rider problem.
Exactly. The community sees who's contributing and who's not.
Right.
And if you're not pulling your weight, people notice.
There are social consequences.
Right. But on the flip side, those who go above and beyond, they get recognized.
Okay.
They're given titles and honored as ancestors after death.
So that's like the highest level of achieved personhood.
Exactly.
Okay. So there's this clear social and moral system that rewards good behavior. But Wiredu also points out that there's a baseline level of personhood that's tied to the okra.
Right. It's like a safety net.
Yeah.
Even if someone isn't really contributing, even if they're seen as a doolittle, they still have okra.
Okay.
And that gives them a basic level of dignity and rights within the community.
So even though there's a spectrum of personhood, there's this fundamental respect for everyone because they're human.
Exactly. That respect is rooted in the shared okra.
Okay, this emphasis on community and responsibility in Wiredu's view, it raises a big question for a lot of people. Uh-oh, what's that? It's about individual freedom.
Okay.
Doesn't this system risk giving the community too much power over the individual?
Right. That's a really valid concern.
Yeah.
Critics worry about a potential tyranny of the majority,
Yeah.
where individual desires and expressions get suppressed because the community always has to come first.
And Gyekye addresses this tension head on. He stresses the importance of individual agency and the ability to think critically.
He does. He insists that individuals are not just passively following whatever their culture says.
Right.
They can think for themselves.
Okay.
They have their own will. They can look at their culture and say, you know what, this part doesn't make sense, or this part is harmful.
So they can question things.
Exactly.
It's interesting.
He argues that even though our culture shapes us, it doesn't completely define us.
Okay.
He even uses the words inelegant, undignifying, or unenlightening to describe aspects of culture that individuals might reject. And this ability to judge for yourself, that's what he sees as central to individual freedom and true moral agency.
So for Gyekye, a person has a degree of autonomy.
Yes.
They can stand apart from social pressure and decide who they want to be.
Exactly. That's what makes them a person.
But even within Wiredu's framework, there's room for challenging the norms of the community.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not just about blindly following tradition.
Okay.
Wiredu recognizes that communities can change for the better.
Yeah.
If someone can make a good argument for changing a norm, and they can persuade others, they can actually achieve a very high degree of personhood.
Okay.
And maybe even become a revered ancestor.
Interesting. So it's not about rejecting community altogether.
No, it's about engaging with it in a thoughtful way.
Okay. I see that. So let's talk about responsibility and free will in Akan philosophy. Wiredu really explores the link between personhood and these concepts.
Right. That's a crucial part of his analysis. He points out that when an adult acts erratically or irresponsibly, the community might use that phrase, onye nipa.
Right.
But it's not necessarily a final judgment.
Aye.
It makes everyone stop and consider what's going on here. Are there underlying causes, psychological or environmental, that might explain this behavior?
Right. So it prompts an investigation.
Exactly. The big question is, when can we hold someone responsible for their actions?
It's a good question.
And Wiredu argues that responsibility is tied to the ability to learn and change through reason and moral guidance.
Okay. So if someone's behavior isn't responsive to reason, does that lessen their responsibility in the Akan view?
Yes, according to Wiredu. If the root of the problem is something outside the person's control, then what looks like irresponsibility might actually be non-responsibility. It's about understanding that real responsibility requires a certain degree of free will.
I see. And the text mentions this Akan idea of equality in unequal circumstances.
Yeah.
It talks about how they might consult a geomancer to understand why someone is behaving strangely.
Right. This is fascinating. The Akan recognize that everyone faces different challenges and has different abilities. So sometimes they'll turn to a diviner or geomancer to get insights into what might be causing this out-of-the-ordinary behavior.
Okay.
And if they determine that the person isn't in control of their actions, the community might formally absolve them of responsibility.
Really?
Yeah. And they have the saying, it is not her eyes, it is not her head, it is not her mind.
Wow.
Which basically means it's not their fault. This shows a really sophisticated understanding of human agency and how complicated moral accountability can be.
It is. It is. So it seems like this idea of okra is really important to both Wiredu and Gyekye.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They both agree that it's this essential life force that makes us human.
But they have different ideas about what it means for personhood.
Right.
Yeah.
They agree on the foundation, but build different structures on top of it.
So Gyekye, he sees the okra as the inner self, the very essence of a person, like life itself. He even calls it okra tisafo, which means the living soul. And he also says it carries destiny. It's called inkrabia, and that it comes from the supreme being. He quotes this proverb, all men are the children of God, no one is the child of the earth.
A powerful image.
It really is.
And for Gyekye, it's this divine essence in every human being that gives us dignity and makes us all morally equal.
Okay.
It's something we all share no matter what.
And Wiredu, even though he defines okra a bit differently, focusing on it as what separates life from death and as the receiver of destiny from God, He agrees that it has this really important moral implication.
Right. They might define it differently.
Yeah.
But for both of them, the okra means that every human being deserves a basic level of respect and has fundamental rights.
Okay.
It's common ground for them, even though they disagree about the details of personhood.
So even though Gyekye acknowledges that people try to achieve social status and they might be called oni bahan if they fail, he insists that this doesn't make them less of a person.
That's right. Remember, for Gyekye, personhood is deeper than that. It comes from being human and having okra. It's not something you lose just because you don't live up to social expectations.
Okay, that makes sense. He's very clear about that.
He says it is social status, not personhood, at which individuals could fail.
He's very consistent.
He is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways for a philosopher listening to this? What are the key insights about this Akan concept of personhood?
I think the Akan view, especially Wiredu's version, offers a really interesting alternative to the very individualistic ideas we often see in Western thought.
Okay.
It presents a system where personhood isn't just something you are, it's something you work towards. You achieve it through your interactions with others, by fulfilling your responsibilities, by being committed to your community.
And it's a system that encourages cooperation and trust.
Exactly. It's designed to solve problems that communities face when everyone is just acting in their own self-interest.
But it's not about sacrificing the individual for the good of the group, right?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Gyekye reminds us that every human being has inherent worth and dignity because of the okra.
Okay.
So even if you don't reach those higher levels of social status, you're still respected as a person.
So there's a balance there.
Exactly. You're encouraged to contribute, but you're also valued just for being human.
So ultimately, what we've explored here is this tension between these two ideas. Do you become a person through what you achieve, or are you a person just because you're human?
Right.
And Wiredu and Gyekye represent these contrasting views. They've given us a lot to think about.
They have.
It really highlights the complexities of this concept of personhood.
It does. And for you, our philosopher listener, I think the question becomes, how does this Gyekian perspective on personhood make you think differently about individual freedom and moral status, especially in the context of Western philosophy?
Yeah.
Does the idea of degrees of personhood change how you think about who counts as a person, especially when it comes to ethical questions? These are some deep questions to ponder.
They are indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Akan philosophy. I think exploring these contrasting views from Wiredu and Gyekye has given us a lot to consider about the nature of personhood.
And if this discussion has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore more of African philosophy.
Yeah.
Read the work of Wiredu and Gyekye. There's a lot more to discover.
Absolutely. I think it's by engaging with these diverse philosophical traditions that we can really expand our understanding of these fundamental concepts that shape our lives. So, until our next deep dive.
I'll see you then.
Take care.